Hi, I'm Laura Flanders. Welcome to the show. This week, two men who have been thinking, writing, and speaking about capitalism for many years. David Harvey is a widely cited author of, among other things, A Companion's Guide to Marx's Capital. Gar Alperovitz is the author most recently of What Then Must We Do?, in which he lays out proposals for democratizing wealth and building an alternative economy. Unless you happen to be one of those who thinks our current economy is doing great and all is hunky-dory in the world of work and money and human relations, you'll have a good idea by now why I've invited these two to talk. With me, with each other, and with you. We're in for something very special. David, Gar, there's so much to discuss with both of you, from capital to labor to work and human relations. But why don't we start by trying to paint a picture of where we are right now? How would you describe, David, the situation in which we find ourselves, economically, maybe humanly speaking?
I think we're at an inflection point in the history of capitalism. Capitalism's what, 200 years old, maybe a little bit more, and it can't be another 200 years of this.
Why not?
And partly because of the rate of growth which is required, this exponential growth rate which goes up and up and up, and of course within it what we see is more and more pressing environmental problems, more and more problems of social inequality, tremendous kinds of difficulties of redistributing wealth, and the political system is completely out of whack and completely purchased by big money power. So, you know, something's got to give, and I think that there's a lot of bubbling going on in the grassroots almost everywhere in the world, saying this system cannot last, and I think the question then is, what's going to replace it and how?
I would put it this way. I think the American system is truly at the reaching, when you say at the end of the system, that's decades on the table when you say that. But I think in the 19th century, basically they ran the system by taking over the continent and killing whoever got in their way, and when they had any great difficulties, land was what run. In the 20th century, the system was stabilized, I don't think by plan, but it was in fact stabilized in the first quarter of the century by World War I, in the second quarter by World War II, the third quarter by the Cold War, Vietnam, Korea, etc. The defense budget's running down to 3% of the economy, and they're running out of war as stabilizers. So I think the system is in decay and stalemate. It can get very nasty. The question is being posed, where does this all go, and how do we begin talking about different systemic possibilities?
Well, I guess that gets me to my question of, is capitalism the problem, or just our U.S. extreme version of it? Gar.
But I think we're talking about capitalism. I mean, that's the nature of the expanding system in all these cases. And I think also the question, the traditional models that have been offered to deal with, if you don't like capitalism, what do you want? The state socialist model is in disregard, and lots of reasons about it in terms of what happened with the Soviet Union and the invasions and the wars. But also there is not an alternative conception of where we really want to go that's fleshed out and talked about. And I think we're on the phase of having a discussion about that. If you don't like corporate capitalism, you don't like state socialism, and we need an answer. How do we begin talking seriously about the next system? And David's written about that in the last book, and I've written about it. I think we've got to have that conversation now. It's really ripe.
Yeah, I think in the 1930s, for example, there was an alternative capitalism which could be invented, which was largely social democratic, state managed, and partly based also, of course, on war and the like. That ran into crisis at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, and another capitalism was invented, which we often refer to as neoliberal capitalism, and everything gets privatized, everything gets commodified, we start to dismantle the welfare state and all the rest of it. So we've gone that path. But there's no alternative form of capitalism right now, and I think what is striking about this crisis, which has been brewing for a long time but broke out but really badly in 2008, is nobody's got a real clear answer to where to go right now, which suggests to me that the time is ripe to say, well, maybe we should go outside of capitalism and talk about some alternative system.
At the heart of that social democratic model, or liberalism in the United States, holding it together, in addition to the war that stimulated the economy, was the labor movement, traditional labor movement. And that's disintegrated. That you don't get social democracy or liberalism without a reasonably strong labor movement. It's gone from 34% of the labor force organized in the early 50s to 11%, 6% in the private sector.
That's right.
Any model that gets us beyond capitalism is going to be changing and socializing ownership of capital. That's the name of the game. And the question is, how do you do that in a way that is somehow not statist, that produces a humane vision, that is productive, that is ecologically sensible, that is defending of liberty rather than oppressing liberty. And it's time for a really powerful discussion and experimentation of that kind. We are seeing, cooperatives and worker-owned companies experimenting. We're seeing more complex city-owned national kind of municipalizations in Boulder. We're seeing experiments in Cleveland where it's neighborhood-wide ownership structures that incorporate worker participation. So we're seeing experimentation with alternative forms or state public banks. But these are all preliminaries that begin to suggest some of the possibilities that a theoretical model, which we can talk about if you'd like, might ultimately involve.
What do you think, David?
I think, I like a lot of the experimentation that's going on. It's great. But the problem I have with it is that people are often thinking about remedies for poverty or remedies for social distress. I think we should be actually trying to think about how to appropriate the wealth that has been appropriated from us. There is immense wealth out there, which is concentrated in a very, very small group of the population. It has assembled that wealth over the last 30 or 40 years incredibly powerfully. And I kind of think everybody who's working in an anti-poverty organization ought to join an anti-wealth organization and actually let us take back that wealth which has been taken from us and somehow or other redistribute it, because I think there's plenty of wealth to go around where everybody could have a decent life and a decent living environment. But right now we can't, because certain people have billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they did very well, by the way, out of this last crisis. All the data show that these guys came out of the crisis very fast, and actually some of them doubled or tripled their wealth in 3 or 4 years since the crisis, while everybody else has done very badly. So when we kind of say the system is in crisis, it's not in crisis for them. The top 1% has come out of it extremely well. They're doing very well. They are very successful, and the rest of us are doing very badly.
So it's not in crisis enough.
No.
Well, that goes to the question of, are we struggling in the right places? History, as you've written, of movements, and you just talked about the labor movement, has led us to fight in the place of workplace struggles around hours and wages and promotion and control. You could look at cooperatives as another experiment on that front. But where else could this change work be happening? And is it wrong to be still focusing on the workplace?
The trouble right now is we're not necessarily focusing on the workplace, and I don't think we should be necessarily focusing on the workplace. I actually think if you look at all of the unrest that's burst out, for instance in Brazil just recently, or you look at what happened in Turkey in Gezi Park and all the rest of it, what was it about? It was about the qualities of urban life. Okay? So it's not simply about the factory and the workplace, it's about the qualities of urban living. And actually there were a lot of revolutionary uprisings which have occurred over the last 20 or 30 years have been really, to me, urban rebellions. Interesting echoes of the 1960s.
Yeah.
They've been urban rebellions rather than simply focused on the workplace. And I think we should take those urban rebellions very seriously and say people want an alternative form of urbanization. They want decent housing and a decent living environment, and those questions are absolutely crucial, as well as the traditional questions that the left has looked at, which is organizing in the workplace.
We haven't had it in the United States. We haven't had the kind of uprisings that you're talking about. So we haven't seen that yet. And when we had it last time, there wasn't any content. People uprose. There was not a sense of where to go with it. So I think we've got to begin to develop what the models are, and again, where does that take us?
Yeah, part of my problem is we're not even thinking about it. It's systematically enough.
Well, where do you see shifts happening? I mean, I will say that one of the great contributions of the women's movement, of the feminist movement, was to say that the realm of the personal is political. It's been women over here who've been saying, actually, while you guys are just focusing on the workplace, the home and the quality of life that we're living outside of the factory deserves another look.
Yes. Yeah.
Hope there, maybe, in the organizing of women workers and home care workers and mothers and teachers and all the rest.
And not only there, I mean, there were a group, and there still are a group of feminist city planners I mean, the way in which capital is organized now, you put the suburb here, you split people over here, the man goes away or the woman goes away, who's going to take care of the kids? It's all isolated. The reconstruction, literally, of the design of the city becomes part and parcel of what we need to talk about.
Right. Less separation between the paid work and at the moment still unpaid.
There's wonderful work that has been done by women city planners to say the non-sexist city. What does it actually look like that would actually build community? And then how do we, I think there is a critical aspect because we've got to somehow begin to put these pieces together as a coherent dialogue. We were talking earlier about it's time to have this conversation.
Yes.
We've talked about Murray Bookchin's work or other people who started with laying out a conception that begins to fulfill these values that is neither the worker-owned model narrowly or the state-owned model, that actually begins to emphasize these values and provide structural base for it. That's on the table.
Two both have in common something else, which is that you talk about networks, about community systems, you talk about communes and territories, I think, in your most recent book.
Yeah, I think territorial organization is very, very significant.
And what do you mean by that, really?
Well, I mean, there are a number of things. I mean, for example, if you want to start thinking about environmental questions, you really have to start to think in terms of bioregions and things like this, which is as self-sufficient as possible in terms of its metabolic relation to the world around it, in terms of food supplies, in terms of, which isn't to say that you just want to imagine that the solution can be entirely local. I mean, we're never going to be able to grow coffee in New York City, and I like my coffee, So we don't want to give up those things, but we can start thinking about, trading relations between bioregions and the like in such a way that actually it's much more environmentally friendly. And we don't then do silly things like import water from Fiji or something like that.
I like what you've just said. If you begin at that level, either at the citywide or the region, and the region's critical in all this, then it becomes how do you stabilize the region? So you move up to the scale. So you have to get to the planning problem and to the state problem. But if you start in terms of territorial questions, I think you're at a good starting place.
You, in your most recent book, talk about the contradictions of capital. You talk about ownership, expanding ownership of capital, but can we define terms a little bit?
Well, capital is money that is used to make more money, or the other way I look at it is that it is the way in which social labor is appropriated by private persons. And therefore the accumulation of capital, to me, is what is central. So capital is not a thing, it's a process. It's a process of circulation of money making more money, and then that's appropriated by individuals. So one of the things I would want to do is to say the more and more of the economy we can take out of that circulation process, the better off we will be. Now, the trend over the last 30 or 40 years is to take everything from, housing to education. I mean, take something like education. More and more it's become sort of integrated into the circulation of capital, where the result is that students are now living in indebtedness and the money kind of calculations drive universities, preschool and all the rest of it. And this is something which ought to be reversed and go in the other direction. In other words, we should have an education system that is decommodified, taken out of the commodity realm, taken out of the realm of the circulation of capital. And you look at healthcare, you look at education, you look at water, you look at basic utilities, you look at housing and so on. You say, there's a mission here. One of the things we can do is decommodify all of those things and start saying we can find a way of providing those socially without going through this business of some people getting extremely rich on playing in the housing market as they did in the housing before the housing market crashed in 2007.
But there are still going to be people who are investing and accumulating wealth. Do we need money that rots or decays or something so that you can't accumulate it?
I love this idea of oxidized money, the money that disintegrates. I mean, and actually people have played around with this, and there are some systems that exist right now which do this.
People are experimenting with time banking and I don't know, Bitcoin.
There's all sorts of banking discussions going on, and with these kinds of questions in mind. That's what the experiments are useful in that respect. Yeah. But it's also important to know, when I went to the University of Wisconsin, a state-owned university, it was what you're talking about. We paid $50 a month, $50 a year kind of tuition, or $90 a semester, something like that. It was provided as a public service, and it was not commodified.
Yeah, I got all the way through to my PhD, and it was all paid for.
Yeah, and that ought to be.
It was all free.
Yeah. So, and there are these elements in the system that can still be developed that way and need to be brought forward as the elements that become part and parcel of the next vision. So yes, that's what this is all about, building a system that actually decommodifies, changes the ownership and functions of capital, but does it in a way that's democratized and decentralized and humane, which has not been part of the actual experience in some parts of the world. So we've got to figure out how to make that real.
The other big issue where we're going to need something is around the question of growth. The problem.
Look, capitalism is a system that must grow. That's its name. In order to the accumulation process continues. They also have to grow against the limits of the ecological limits of the society and the resource limits of the globe of the world. So the next system has got to deal with something that doesn't, by definition, have to grow. We're finding very interesting, very radical people, but also liberals and more moderate people say that really is a question because we've been so propagandized that there really is no alternative. Tina, Thatcher's idea.
I mean, there are a lot of movements around. I mean, I'll just give you one example. There are quite a few progressive mayors being elected and city councils being elected in the United States right now. And then you kind of say to yourself, well, let's think about what kind of alliance they might have together. And many of them are doing things like passing minimum wage ordinances and things like that, and trying to do something, supporting land trusts, trying to turn themselves into what we might call a partnership state with in relationship to social movement. So there is something going on there. Now, if I just say that, then I kind of say, okay, I don't think it's necessarily that progressive, but on the other hand, progressive forces could kind of really, I think, take that on and really change the world.
The crisis is severe enough that you cannot solve the problem the old way.
Right.
And in some parts of the country, people are being forced to experiment. And this is a time when the left needs to be both articulate, active, but also talking to Americans. They want to hear something new that makes sense rather than rhetoric. So I think it's a very important time.
But we've got to have a new way of doing politics.
Yep.
And I think it's a time for invention.
Yep.
And experimentation. And of course, experimentation means you often get things wrong. But we've got to go out there and I think really push.
And embrace that notion that there will be failure.
Yes.
Say that, you can't move forward without that. It's absolutely part of the process.
All right. David, Gar, go out. Make a mistake. Embrace it. Make change.
Just don't sit there.
Thank you both.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for coming in.
Thank you.